Hey guys, during a hostage situation, there are typically three major priorities when entering negotiations: the preservation of life, suspect apprehension, and the protection of property. You would think these mentioned to be straightforward, but in the country of Russia, they actually mean fuck all. And to truly understand their exotic negotiation tactics, today we're going to be discussing the Beslan school siege and the Russian government's unique way of handling the situation. On September 1st, in the Russian town of Beslan, school number 1 was celebrating the beginning of the new academic year. This is known as Knowledge Day, or First Bell, which is widely celebrated throughout Russia, so most students were typically accompanied by their parents or other relatives. About 1,200 people were in the building, much more than usual. But little to their knowledge, in the months prior, just east of the town of Beslan, a group of several dozen terrorists, led by Ruslan Kuchebrov, were planning to take the school hostage. At 9:11 a.m., a group of men and women wearing green camouflage arrived in a stolen military van and stormed the school building wielding rifles. You would assume that the bystanders would have been bothered by an AK-47 being shoved in their faces, but many just assumed that it was the Russian military performing a drill. However, the attackers soon drew arms and began to fire into the air. Also, some evidence suggests that a few terrorists disguised themselves as repairmen and infiltrated long before their comrades, and planted hidden stashes of rifles, ammunition, and explosives. Additionally, many of the attackers were wearing explosive devices around their jackets, belts, and even inside their underpants. The attackers took about 1,200 hostages and crammed them all into the school gymnasium, where they confiscated all cellular devices and ordered the hostages to stay quiet, lay on their knees, and only speak Russian when spoken to. Not everyone in the school could speak or even understand Russian, so to reduce panic, one parent named Ruslan Betrizov decided to translate everything the terrorists were saying into the local language of Ossetic. You would think his good intentions would have been appreciated, but one of the gunmen approached him asking, "Are you done?" and then immediately executed him. And if things weren't tense enough, there was actually some disagreement among the terrorists. You see, a portion of them were opposed to having child hostages, and they wanted to release them. So, Kuchebrov, in fear of deserters, decided to, without warning, remotely trigger the explosive vests of those who openly defied him, killing 2 terrorists and 14 adult captives. All of their bodies were disposed of outside in a big pile. Lastly, one of the terrorists with the sniper positioned himself on top of the gym. Kind of odd to mention now, but he'll be important later. A few hours after the school was taken, the Russian government arrived. Everyone in a 200-meter radius of the school was evacuated, and the scene was surrounded by the Russian police, ministry troops, Russian army forces, Russian National Guard, and the Spetsnaz. Also, an armed group of citizens joined the fight, altogether equaling about 5,000 troops. Although the odds weren't in the attackers' favor, each group mentioned took orders from a completely different government entity, and they were each trained to handle the situation in completely different ways, which is a problem that actively slowed rescue attempts. But now that everyone has settled down, it's time for negotiations. The attackers immediately set the ground rules. Rule number 1. For every gunman injured or killed, they will kill 50 hostages. Second, they lined the school gymnasium with explosives, and made a promise to level the building if anyone stepped too close. Third, all the hostages will not be given food, water, or medication. And fourth, remember the pile of bodies that I mentioned earlier? Well, nobody was allowed to touch it. After hearing these rules, the Russian government made its first public statement, promising they will not use force to acquire any of the hostages. Unsure what to do, the Russian military reached out to Mr. Counterterrorism himself, President George W. Bush, asking for assistance. He said, "Yeah, I'll help," and then proceeded to do nothing. Despite the military being prepared for negotiations, President Vladimir Putin stayed mostly silent. This was probably his attempt at downplaying the severity of the situation, and, as a result, many of the branches of government followed suit, so negotiations were ultimately unsuccessful for the night. Starting on day 2, the Russian media began to cover the crisis, severely undermining it, only citing 354 hostages and 15 captors. But, unsurprisingly, nobody believed it, and thousands began to protest Putin's silence. Some of the citizens on site began to riot in fear that the government would utilize its hostage crisis chemical agent, which is a fancy name for fentanyl gas. For context, this cocktail was used 2 years prior during another terrorist situation called the Debrecka Theater Siege, and it was responsible for the death of 131 citizens. Under the pressure, Putin finally stepped up and he said, "Don't worry guys, I got this." Then resumed his silence, which he wouldn't break for the remainder of the crisis. In the afternoon, the gunmen grew tired of the constant screaming of some of the toddlers, so they allowed former Army General Ruslan Ayushev to come inside and retrieve 11 mothers and 15 infants. And when doing so, they gave him a note. The note contained demands from warlord Shamil Basiev, who requested the formal independence for Chechnya. Obviously, Russia had no intention of giving up its land, but this was a step in the right direction. Inside the gymnasium, the lack of food and water started to take a toll on some of the hostages. Additionally, due to the tightly packed room, it grew extremely hot, so many of the hostages passed out, and some, to prevent heat exhaustion, took off all their clothes. Of course, the parents weren't too jazzed about their kids being baked alive, so they forced the captors to temporarily take their kids outside and hose them down with water, which was refreshing, but it didn't look too good from afar. Also, the attackers were stressed, sleep-deprived, and, wouldn't you know it, suffering from heroin withdrawals. A side effect of hopping off heroin cold turkey is for one to experience manic episodes, so as the night followed, the captors would pull some goofy pranks like randomly firing their weapons toward the police or lobbing grenades at military vehicles. The Russian forces kept their cool and did not respond once with force. After just a few hours into the third day, somehow a lot of progress was made. A former police general was nearing a breakthrough in negotiations. He found 700 well-known Russian figures who were volunteering to replace the child hostages. And, to his surprise, the attackers agreed to a face-to-face discussion the next day. They also allowed the military to clean up the outside pile of bodies, which, by now, didn't smell too pleasing. So, immediately 4 medical workers and 2 ambulances went to carefully retrieve the bodies. During this transaction, one of the Federal Forces marksmen decided to kill the sniper on top of the gymnasium. Little did he know, but should have expected, the sniper's foot was on a dead man's switch, which, upon his death, triggered the explosives that lined the gymnasium roof. It wasn't clear why he killed the sniper, but some sources say that the terrorist shot first. But at that point, it really didn't matter. Within minutes, the burning roof collapsed, decimating the gymnasium, killing an estimated 160 hostages. At this point, negotiations were off, and the situation immediately evolved into disorganized warfare. The Russian forces and separatists began to fire at each other. The radios the military used were flooded with mixed commands. Some voices were demanding the attack, while others were calling for an immediate fallback. But before we carry on, remember when the Russians said they will not use force to acquire any of the hostages? Well, the entire time, the Russian military was supported by 2 T-72 tanks, a few BTR-armed vehicles, and an Mi-24 attack helicopter. Not to mention, a dozen soldiers were given RPGs. And these soldiers were told, once, at any point, if shooting starts, go fucking nuts. And so they did. Ignoring all demands for a ceasefire, tanks unleashed a total of 6 high-explosive shells into the school. Soldiers from the surrounding buildings launched dozens of incendiary missiles and grenades into the already burning gymnasium. One of the armed vehicles drove close to the building and started firing into the windows, and all the while hundreds of hostages still occupied the building. Many of the armed locals joined in, but some were so confused they began to shoot in random directions. Sometimes they even accidentally struck allies or fleeing hostages. The surviving terrorists fled further into the school, using the captives as human shields. The hostages were forced to stand in front of the windows where they were met with gunfire. Finally, after 2 hours of chaos, the remaining handful of militants surrendered, and the Russian troops claimed control of the building. A total of 333 innocents were killed, and despite there being hundreds of injured, only a few ambulances were available. Most of the wounded were transported to hospitals by private vehicles. In the days that followed, funerals were conducted, and the local cemetery was too small and needed to be expanded. Some of the officials in charge of dealing with the Beslan school crisis stepped down, and amendments were passed that expanded the powers of law enforcement. After a few weeks, investigations concluded, and, surprise surprise, Russian law enforcement was notified in advance about the attack. But the leaked intelligence didn't mention the school by name, so instead of locking down the 7 schools in the suspected region, they just ignored it. Also, Putin turned a blind eye towards the victims, denying government aid and, most importantly, answers. Anyway, my name is Keener, and have a blessed day.